This is one of the largest public embezzlement cases in state history. This is a sprawling conspiracy.
So, where is all the money? What happened to it? Welcome to part 2 of the Mississippi Embezzlement scheme. A scheme that Shad White, the state auditor, says cost the American taxpayers $77 million. $77 million. He describes it as the biggest embezzlement scheme in the state in the past 2 decades. But where did the money go and what was it spent on? Well, I'm about to tell you. What happened to the 6 people that were indicted? I'm going to tell you that too. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you really need to go watch part 1 of the Mississippi Embezzlement Scheme video that I already did. I'm going to leave a link in the description box down below. But first, good morning. My name is Jessica and welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for taking a chance on me and clicking on this video. If you are new here, and you probably are, it would be amazing if you could hit the like and subscribe buttons. It would really help me grow my channel. Okay, so back to the story. So the state auditor has demanded repayment of $77 million of our federal money that was misspent. The missing money comes out of the state's temporary assistance program for needy families. And the government is very strict on how this money can be spent. So by law, you can provide assistance to needy families so that children may be cared for in their own homes or in the homes of relatives. You can end the dependence of needy parents on government benefits by promoting job preparation, work, and marriage. You can prevent and reduce the incidence of out-of-wedlock pregnancies and establish annual numerical goals for preventing and reducing the incidence of these pregnancies. You can encourage the formation and maintenance of two-parent families. And that's it. That's all the money can be used for. It's listed in the grants issued by the state, and it's also required to be listed in any subgrants. So what happened to the money? Basically, the money went to enrich John Davis, Nancy New, their friends and their families, and several other professional sports athletes. So several other professional athletes. So John Davis, the director of the Mississippi Department of Human Services, who is responsible for providing the grants where our welfare money goes, he is responsible for the vast majority of it, as he was the person with the state that was responsible for the dispensation of the funds. So then he would then issue grants to MCEC, which is ran by Nancy New and her son, or FRC, which is the Family Resource Center of North Mississippi, who is ran by Christy Webb. So these two nonprofit charities together are responsible for Families First of Mississippi and making sure they have the funding and whatever they need. So they would in turn issue subgrants. At this time, the only arrests in the case are Nancy New, Zach New, and their accountant that worked for MCEC, Brett DiBiase, who was a former wrestler who worked for the state and received some grants, and John Davis and Latimer Smith, who both worked for MDHS. Brett DiBiase was the only subrecipient of any of the funds that was arrested, and no employees of FRC or any of their recipients have been arrested at this time. But Shad White did file a civil lawsuit on behalf of the state against the recipients of the money, claiming that they all knew this was welfare money and that it was intended for the state's poorest residents. All while this was going on, approval for state applicants to receive the funds really dwindled. It dropped dramatically. So as I stated, the recipients of the welfare money can be broken down into 3 categories, and that's the way it's broken down into the civil lawsuit. You have the family and friends of John Davis, you've got the family and friends of Nancy New, then you've got professional athletes, and then there's a few more companies that were not going to finish their contract, and so they just said, contract null and void, and you owe us this money. So first, let's talk about the friends and family of John Davis. And so Brian Smith was John Davis's brother-in-law. They resided at the same house. The state paid him over $600,000 to be a leadership outreach coordinator. They paid his nonprofit Transformational Ventures, which he established just to receive this money. They paid him for Early Childhood Academy, and then they also paid $365,000 to lease a property that didn't exist. So the next person we come to is Austin Smith, and he is John Davis's nephew. And he was paid over $400,000 to perform coding as a paid employee, a skill that he didn't have, and to also teach coding skills to economically needy students when he couldn't even code in the first place. So the next person we're going to look at is Ted DiBiase Sr. And Ted DiBiase Sr. is formerly known as the $1 Million Man in wrestling, if y'all watch wrestling. I don't, so. So he was formerly known as the $1 Million Man in the professional wrestling world and the entertainment world. He was paid over $1.7 million to his nonprofit, Heart of David Ministries, with no oversight. So Heart of David paid for numerous personal expenses incurred by Ted DiBiase, including multiple flight upgrades, local restaurant meals, debts for a vehicle purchase, and high dollar but unexplained payments to Heart of David board members. Though Heart of David maintained a website, the website content was entirely created at MDHS expense by an employee at MDHS as ordered by John Davis. So the next person we're going to talk about today is Ted DiBiase Jr., which is the $1 Million Man's son. So Ted DiBiase Jr., he was paid over $3 million, and him and John Davis, they were always rubbing elbows. I think he was like his BFF. John Davis appointed him the Director of Sustainable Change. And he got an office that was just as big as John Davis's office at MDHS. So together they took first-class trips and stayed in premier hotel rooms paid for from, you guessed it, your tax dollars. So in May of 2017, Ted DiBiase Jr. formed Priceless Ventures, LLC, solely to receive funds for temporary aid for needy families for his own enrichment. In June 2018, he formed another nonprofit, Family Orientum LLC, to funnel more welfare dollars. So next we're going to talk about Brett DiBiase, and he was the one who was arrested with the MDHS and the MCEC employees. So Brett DiBiase, he was paid over $800,000. He was an employee for MDHS for 7 months as Director of Transformational Change. He created a nonprofit, Restored 2 LLC, and he was paid $48,000 for training in avoiding and overcoming substance abuse. While he was supposed to be doing this training, however, he was at his own drug rehab facility called Rise in Malibu, California. So this is a luxury drug rehab facility with majestic ocean views, because we were all very, very concerned about that. And so while he was receiving drug treatment, this was arranged by John Davis, was paid for with welfare money, and then we also paid for John Davis to fly out there first class, get a premier hotel room, and ride around in a chauffeured limousine to visit Brett DiBiase. So another family and friend of John Davis is going to be Adam Such. Adam Such was introduced to Davis by Teddy DiBiase Jr. He was paid $250,000 by the state for activities related to a Center for Excellence and a referral network. So the next person we're going to talk about is Nicholas Coughlin. Nicholas Coughlin was a business associate of Ted DiBiase Jr. So they paid NCC Ventures, which is owned by Coughlin, over $160,000 to perform vague tasks such as having conversations with industry leaders. So our last person that falls, it's really a group, our last group that falls under John Davis's friends and family is the Northeast Mississippi Football Coaches Association. Davis paid them $30,000 as a reward to the coaching association for having Teddy DiBiase Jr. as their banquet keynote speaker. This happened at their 2018 annual All-Star Game banquet that is held at Northeast Mississippi Community College. The contributions by MCEC was treated as a sponsorship of the May 2019 All-Star Week events. So now let's talk about family and friends of Nancy New. So we're going to start with Nancy's son, Jesse New. Jesse New was paid over $500,000 for consulting services that he did not perform. Nancy New and their whole private school system that they have going on, it's funded by New Learning Resources. So New Learning Resources is responsible for $6.5 million that they were paid through subsidies. So in this private school scam, prosecutors say the News claimed public school funds by using the names of kids who didn't attend school there. People who didn't work at the school are teachers who had a lower certification level than they claimed. The funding came from a special program called 504 Teachers Units, which is supposed to supply a private teacher for a child after a doctor or a psychologist determines the student requires placement in a hospital or a licensed psychiatric facility. The schools were for kids with autism and dyslexia. So an analysis by Mississippi Today, the paper, shows New Learning Resources received roughly $20 million since 2007. Between 2016 and 2020, New Summit School in Jackson and North New Summit School in Greenwood each reported hiring between 10 and 16 teachers through the 504 Teacher Units program per year, according to public records. This translates to around 325 kids with severe mental disorders, which is roughly the size of their whole school district. So basically, with the funds they are being paid from the government, they should basically have one-on-one teaching for every student that goes to school there with autism and dyslexia. So prosecutors haven't outlined where all of this money went, but they accuse her of using at least some of the money to buy her $250,000 home located in Northeast Jackson. And so the next person that falls under Nancy New, her family and friends, is Jacob Vanlandingham. And we did briefly touch on Jacob Vanlandingham in the previous video. He is the owner and founder of Provocus, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and Presol MD. And so he was actually creating an anti-concussion treatment drug. Well, it's a treatment, I don't know if it's a drug, but he was creating something for anti-concussions. And Brett Farve has actually been supporting his foundation since 2014. But again, that is going to be in my next video, so y'all come back and watch that. Okay, and so Jacob Vanlandingham with Provocus and Presol, that is the medical company, the medical treatment company out of Florida that the News invested in with the welfare money. So he was paid $2.1 million. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but he met with Nancy New and John Davis, then director of MDHS, and so he knew where the money was coming from. And the whole $2.1 million was done under the guise that when Provocus started doing their clinical trials, they were going to locate their clinical trials to Mississippi, but it never happened. He ended up selling the drug to Odyssey, and we'll talk about it in the next video. Okay, so that's what the News were up to. Now let's talk about the other sports athletes that received money. So we're just going to jump in with Brett Favre. In addition to this $2 million scandal with Provocus, in addition to $5 million for the volleyball field at USM, which will also be covered in the next video. He personally took $1.1 million out of the welfare pool. He says he didn't know that that's where it came from, but he has paid back the $1.1 million. And again, that'll be in the next video. Another sport athlete that received money from the temporary assistance for needy families was Paul LaCoste. LaCoste is a former linebacker at Mississippi State who's now a fitness trainer and a motivational speaker. He was paid over $1.3 million to Victory Sports to run 3 fitness boot camps for fee-paying participants, public officials, and political staffers. So the last person we're going to talk about that was a professional athlete is Marcus Dupree. And you might have heard of him. He was a pretty big deal, I think, football player. So he's been contracted for celebrity endorsement and to be a motivational speaker to promote Families First in Mississippi. And he was also paid with temporary assistance for needy family monies to raise money for MCEC. MCEC transferred $171,000 for a down payment to his house and then another $200,000 to lease the land that adjoined to it, although that never happened. And it spells it out. So if the MCEC would have leased this land and this adjacent building that was supposedly there, the rent on it would have worked out to $9,500 a month. But it spells it out, I thought was really interesting. It spells it out in the civil suit, and it describes the house as having over 4,300 square feet, 15.4 acres of land for horses, a swimming pool and a swimming pool pavilion, all within a gated community. How nice is that? Isn't it lovely how he's enjoying our tax dollars? And it's all in the lawsuit. So there was another category, and it was called other contractual violations. So the first one we're going to talk about on this is South Tech Incorporated. And South Tech Incorporated was paid over $100,000 to install internet and phone systems. Chase Computer Systems is the next one. They were paid over $375,000 for a software application to track and manage the welfare programs. The next one is a mouthful. It is Warren, Washington, Issaquena, Sharkey. Those are all counties in Mississippi. Warren, Washington, Issaquena, Sharkey Community Action Agency. They were paid over $49,000 for direct services to reduce out-of-wedlock pregnancies, tutor kids, and train teenagers and adults. And the last one is Soul City Hospitality. They were paid $200,000 to lease a building in Jackson that was never occupied, and it was never intended to be occupied. So in the civil lawsuit, it lists John Davis as owing more than $23 million. It lists MCEC as owing more than $19 million. And it lists FRC, which is the Family Resource Center of North Mississippi, as owing more than $4 million. Since then, Shad White has sent out demands for repayment in the amount of $96.3 million to John Davis, who was the director at the time. This is for $77 million of misspent funds plus interest. MCEC got a demand for $68 million, and FRC got a demand for $15 million. Again, both of these sums are going to be included in the $77 million John Davis is being gone after for. Although Davis took his direction from his boss, the man who hired him in 2016, then Governor Phil Bryant, the auditors have not placed any blame or culpability on the state's top officials at this time. There has been some controversy surrounding the auditor, Shad White, and the former governor, Phil Bryant. Wouldn't you know, they go way back, by like more than a decade. How about that? So White served as policy director when Bryant was lieutenant governor. He was also his gubernatorial campaign manager in 2015. Bryant appointed White as state auditor and supported him in his subsequent election. The auditor position is a pretty big position because it's known to be a political career launching pad. Mississippi has taken some steps to make sure this kind of corruption embezzlement doesn't happen again. In May 2020, Anderson, the current executive director, appointed the agency's first chief compliance officer, Sandra Griffith, to help combat any future fraud. They have also reverted back to the formal bidding process that requires contracts to be bid before grants are awarded. So let's talk where we're at on the legal side of things. Brett DiBiase pled guilty to fraud in 2020, and he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Ann McGrew pled guilty in 2021 to one charge of conspiracy to commit embezzlement, and she agreed to testify against her former employers, The News. I'm not really sure what happened to Latimer Smith's trial. I found in October of 2021, so last year he pled not guilty, and it said he was supposed to go to court November the 8th. I'm assuming that was last November, but I cannot find anything about what happened, so I'm assuming it's either been pushed back or he hasn't gone yet. So in September 2021, 2022, John Davis pled guilty. And this is what he pled guilty to. 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and theft concerning programs receiving federal funds, and 1 count of theft concerning programs receiving federal funds. He also pled guilty to 5 counts of conspiracy and 13 counts of fraud against the government. Under the plea agreement, the state recommends that Davis be sentenced to 90 years with 32 years of that sentence to be served in prison, as well as be required to pay restitution in the amount of $220,897. He is scheduled for sentencing on February the 2nd of 2013 years. So he's scheduled for, I don't know what I just said. He's scheduled for sentencing on February the 2nd of 2023. And he is a 54, y'all. So that puts him getting out at 86, maybe a few years earlier for good behavior. I don't know, but it is not looking good for Team Davis. So let's look at the news. And first, we're going to talk about their federal pleas. So Nancy New pled guilty to federal wire fraud, which carries up to a 10-year sentence and a $250,000 fine. Her son, Zachary New, pled guilty to federal conspiracy, which carries up to 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. And they can spend their time in federal prison and not in our state's barbaric prison system, because it's pretty awful out here. So the state sentencing is going to be after the federal sentencing, which is scheduled for November the 9th. But y'all listen to the state charges. So on state charges, she pled guilty and faces up to 100 years in prison on 4 counts of bribery, 2 counts of fraud against the government, 6 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of racketeering. So her son Zachary in state prison on his state charges faces up to 75 years, and he pled guilty to 4 counts of bribery, 2 counts of fraud against the government, and 5 counts of mail fraud. They are getting a super light sentence with the federal government, wouldn't you say? So I feel like they got some good stuff to say. And I feel like it hadn't come out yet, but I think it's going to. This is an ongoing investigation, and as part of their guilty pleas with the federal government, Nancy New and Zachary New acknowledged that they invested $4 million into the volleyball field that is located at USM. And wouldn't you know, Brett Farve supported construction for the volleyball field? Actually, I think he was given credit for most of it. So another thing that was part of the plea deal is the mother and son also acknowledged that they gave money to Provocus. You know who else was a big supporter of Provocus? That's right, Brett Farve. You know who else was also involved in Provocus and the volleyball field? Could it be the governor? You'll have to come back and see. So y'all come back and watch my next video, and we'll take a closer look at those parts of the scandal. So what did y'all think about this? Can y'all believe this? $77 million in federal funds are missing, while only approving 1.42% of applications? That's some shady stuff right there, y'all. Y'all drop me a comment in the section down below. As always, thank you for watching. Bye!